Thank you for listening to Buffalo What's Next on WBFO. Buffalo What's Next is on summer break and will return with new content shortly. As we take this break, please continue to tune in to WBFO Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. and 9 p.m. for producer picks of some of our favorite episodes of Buffalo What's Next.
How can we afford not to talk about race?
About education, about segregation, about humanity.
Since the dawn of this nation, racial violence has existed.
The way we have designed our society has a big hand in what occurred in that Tops Market.
The suburban area, everywhere. We must work and teach our children.
We need to make sure that we put more funding in our programs that help prevent gun violence and more money into art.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
On today's episode of Buffalo What's Next, Summertime Producer Picks, we highlight 3 segments from previous shows. Jay Moran speaks with journalist and former WKBW reporter Madison Carter from June 14th of last year. We continue with Jay Moran speaking with Harper Bishop, formerly a part of Push Buffalo, to talk about the power of a united community voice in the fight for social and racial justice from June 16th of last year. And we end the show with excerpts from Making Space's panel discussion at Buffalo Art Studio from December 15th of last year, where they discuss art, urban planning, and economic justice. First, an update from Jay Moran.
You're listening to an earlier conversation on Buffalo What's Next with journalist Madison Carter. After spending considerable time covering Buffalo as a reporter for WKBW TV Channel 7, she was working in Atlanta at the time of this interview. She is now an anchor and investigative reporter for WSOC TV in Charlotte, North Carolina. And welcome back to Buffalo What's Next. Our next guest is very familiar to Buffalo TV audiences, Madison Carter, formerly of Channel 7 here in Buffalo. Spent about 3 years here, now with 11 Alive in Atlanta. A couple of other interesting elements here with Madison. She also came back and reported in Buffalo following the May 14th shootings at the Jefferson Avenue Tops for WGRZ TV. Madison, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be with you.
We've got a lot to talk about here, but you didn't lose your connections. It wasn't that long a time ago that you were in Buffalo. So if you could just take us back to your first impressions when you heard about the shootings on Jefferson Avenue.
Yeah, I mean, Buffalo, I always tell people I'm DMV born. I was born outside of D.C., but I say I'm Buffalo bred because my time there just really shaped me as a human being. I still have so many friends, people I consider family in Buffalo, and that's really how I started hearing about it. Some former journalists who were in Buffalo started reaching out to me that Saturday afternoon. Have you heard about what happened? And as soon as I heard, I got home and I turned on the TV, and I turned on Channel 7 where I used to work, and I'm watching the wall-to-wall coverage. Ashley Rowe was on. The reporters were in the field. I'm scrolling through my phone on Twitter trying to get as many details as possible. Stories that I had been working on during my time in Buffalo that I wasn't able to complete were just popping into my head. And then I started getting messages from friends, from close friends. And I remember one message, he said that his aunt was killed. And that was Pearlie Young, and that's when it really hit me. I was like, I know this community so deeply, like, that I'm being impacted by what happened. I know someone who knows someone who was killed, and that's when it really started to set in for me what was going on.
And then you get the call to come here to actually cover it because the station that you work with in Atlanta is the owner is the same that owns WGRZ TV here in Buffalo. So you come to Buffalo. Now give me your first impressions about your reporting and what you saw when you came here. And again, maybe take us through that understanding of the neighborhood that was impacted here that really a lot of Western New Yorkers don't have an understanding of.
I think my first impressions and my first emotions were on the plane, and it was honestly disappointment because I remember covering the riots after George Floyd's death a few years ago, and at that time I was president of the Buffalo Association of Black Journalists, and I remember being out there, and I sent out this tweet that got a lot of traction, and I said, I was the only black journalist that was covering those riots. And after that, there was so much momentum. I met with all of the newsroom leaders, and they said, you're right, this was not acceptable. We need to make sure our newsrooms are in a place to be able to respond if there's another racially charged incident or racially motivated incident. And, we're going to make sure we're in a position if this happens again. So when I say disappointment, it was disappointment because I was once again on a plane being flown into a community because the newsrooms were not in a position to respond to that community once again. And so I kind of felt a little let down that that mission wasn't accomplished of making sure our newsrooms had diversified enough. And let me pause here and say the coverage was outstanding.
Sure.
It was great. It was fantastic. The journalists they're strong journalists, but you come into that community, like had they been there before? When was the last time a lot of those journalists had been over there, with or without a camera? Did they know anybody? I went and I saw friends, family, neighbor. My next door neighbor was standing next to me on the sidewalk when I was over there. And so that was sort of my first emotion. I was a little sad that we still didn't have diverse newsrooms to where they had enough sources. I remember I was still pulling out sources from. I didn't even have my work phone anymore. So I kind of wish that we had done a better job in Buffalo of responding.
Yeah, and in that regard, I'll kind of jump into a different topic that I was going to come to later in this conversation, but you really touched upon it there. I know the NABJ did a survey of the local newsrooms. I think it was maybe a year ago when you were still here, and talked about the lack of people of color in the newsrooms here. Let's just ask a question from your perspective. How has it impacted Buffalo, from what you understand, from your time here in Buffalo? How has it impacted Buffalo in a negative sense for not having that representation on TV, in radio here in Buffalo?
It's made it so that people only hear about people in the Black community when there's something wrong. I remember getting hired and they told me, hey, make sure you don't live on the east side. And I said, why? And I remember eventually, after a couple of years of being there, I used to just turn to people and say, they're just Black people. Like, it's just Black people. It's okay. They're just Black people. There's nothing wrong. And I think that, and it's not even that there's something wrong or there's something nefarious. People go to where they're comfortable.
Sure.
I would be there because I was comfortable. Everybody flocks to their own communities. And so I think it's impacted it negatively because it's othered any news that has to do with Black people, because people are uncomfortable and they're, worried they're not going to have the proper perspective. So they just stay away from it entirely. And that's not helpful for others because no one really understood the needs of that community until there was something wrong, and no one cares. So I really think that's why it's important to have different kinds of people in newsrooms so that they can be plugged into different communities. So that you can respond appropriately and with proper perspective if something's wrong or, when there are positive things happening as well.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into that because that is one of the things one of the types of questions we've had here the last couple of weeks. Talk about the strengths of those neighborhoods. What makes them special?
Yeah, I love that question. It's the community. And even being away from Buffalo, people ask me, do you love Atlanta? And I was like, because I miss the community. I miss how much people care. When you're over there east of Main Street, it's this tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone. They go based on your last name. I remember I got to Buffalo and they said, what's your last name? Who are your people? Who's your family? Where does your mom work? It's the food, the culture. Like, it's still a community where recipes are passed down. Like, there's some recipes I learned just from being in Buffalo that they were not on Pinterest or in cookbooks. It's because they're being passed down generationally through families. The shopping, meeting up, talking, like, people still really, really know each other. And they really care about each other. They take care of each other. Churches, everyone knows if I need anything done in Buffalo, I'm starting at a church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting with the pastor because they can plug me into anyone. They are the hubs essentially on the east side of Buffalo. So it's this amazing place with amazing people who really know each other and care about each other. There's this joke, like, there's certain areas where you don't have cell phone coverage, and that's probably why people still know each other. You can't even use your cell phone, so you actually have to talk to people in certain parts of the east side of Buffalo. It's just one of the most amazing places, honestly.
Do you have a favorite place? Is there a favorite place that you miss in that neighborhood?
Is there a favorite place I miss? Honestly, I've had some of the best catfish in my life at Fat Cats. It's off of Kensington. So I know you didn't ask this question, but I've gotten it. And people are saying, how can you be integrated in this community, without just being like, hello, I'm a white person and I want to explore a black neighborhood. Like, explore things like that. Go to some restaurants, stop by that library. I don't know. Even the Broadway Market. That's on the east side of Buffalo, but people almost think of it as an other. And I'm like, no, that's part of the east side of Buffalo. Like, that's almost explains Buffalo, Broadway Market, right? And all of the culture and just coming together. But just, start to explore some of the parks. The parks are amazing. There's so many ways to just get to know your neighbors without trying to make a spectacle of like, hey, what's going on over here?
We'll get right back to our conversation on Buffalo What's Next on WBFO.
Buffalo Toronto Public Media's unique and valued programming on WNED PBS, WNED Classical, and WBFO make us a perfect partner for any company interested in making a real difference in our community. Your support has the power to associate your business with one of the most trusted brands in North America. Call me, Sylvia Bennett, to find out how you can make a difference. 716-845-7005.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter at WBFO or email us at news@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
We are talking with Madison Carter today on Buffalo What's Next. Madison spent about 3 years at Channel 7 here in Buffalo, was back also covering the May 14th shootings on Jefferson Avenue for WGRZ TV. She now works for 11 Alive in Atlanta. Kyle Mackey, my former colleague here, introduced you to our audience, as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago in very memorable fashion. You already brought it up in our conversation. The protests at Niagara Square. This is after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And like you said, you were the only black journalist on the scene at that time. But also, can you maybe tell us about your reporting and how you came to understand how the police interacted with the black community here in Buffalo and how it has impacted that community?
It's one of those water is wet kind of stories now, where you look at the numbers of how many people are being pulled over and what kind of tickets are being given out, misdemeanor, who's in the jail. People feel that the black community is over-policed. The whole stop and frisk scenario where people were literally just being pulled over or stopped because they were black. And so this is just a generational thing. This has been happening for a long time in Buffalo, where there's a distrust of police. And so I think that if going back to the protests, things were fine until police started making their presence known. And that's when people started wanting to agitate and really the tensions rose once police were there, because people just don't trust them. I remember the incident with the young lady. This was very, very well known in Buffalo, where the officer called her the C word. That was on the west side of Buffalo. And so there's just all these incidents that come up where people are just, they don't trust police, frankly. And so I always talk about the Buffalo peacemakers, how they're the intermediary between the police. Like they work with the police department, but they don't have the badge. They don't have the gun. And so often I think it's one of the smartest things the Buffalo Police Department has done is to really bring in the peacemakers as that assistance to help them to send, hey, somebody that you've seen in your neighborhood before, you know this person. Pastor James Giles is the head of Peacemakers, and he's familiar to people in the community, so they can kind of send him ahead to help with that interaction. And I don't really have the answers as to how you can rebuild that trust, but I think it starts with equity in policing and making sure the police are a part of the community, right? As opposed to just going into community and saying, like, we're here to keep you safer, when that's not what they're doing. They're just here to try to make their presence known.
You're from Washington, D.C. You now live in Atlanta, two very heavily black communities, for sure, here in the United States. Can you take us through what you know about Atlanta? You haven't been there that long just yet, but compare what life is like there for a person of color compared to the way it is in Buffalo.
Atlanta is one of the most truly integrated cities I've ever lived in. It's not forced integration. It's just you can go anywhere and see all kinds of different people. And I always say it's so different from Buffalo, because in black communities all over America, it's a black community. You know, we go down together, we ride together. There's essentially a lot of people trying to protect, even if you're doing something wrong, there's a sense of needing to protect somebody in the black community if you're another black member. That is not true in Atlanta. It doesn't matter what color you are, people are going to operate how they're going to operate. And that's the most unique thing to me. And I see it play out in Buffalo, I think particularly with the mayor. You have a black mayor, and you have a black community that's very frustrated with him, but they still keep electing him, right? Mm-hmm. Because they continue to want to give him a chance to say, okay, you didn't do your first term, your second term, your third term, or your fourth term. We know your fifth term, you're finally going to get around to helping us out. And it's just like, and that's what I'm used to, like black people, you know, sticking with each other. That's not true of Atlanta at all. And it's the most fascinating thing to me. It really is.
Any understanding of what the case may be? Because when I was there, I only spent a few days there years ago, though I felt a comfort between black and white in Atlanta that I most certainly have not felt here in Buffalo.
That's exactly it. You really, truly can go anywhere, to any upscale restaurant, any, you know, hole-in-the-wall restaurant, and there are black people, there are white people, there are Asian people, there are Indian people. It's incredible, and I love it. And I think it's because there are enough. I've truly, even living outside of Washington, D.C., I never saw a true black middle and upper class. That exists in Atlanta, and that does not exist in other communities, and that's why you see what you see. In Buffalo, there's not a black middle class. There's not a black upper class. Most of the black community is they're living like at or below the poverty line. So there's this sense of we all need to come up together, like we all need to help each other rise. And in Atlanta, enough people have risen above that line to where we can operate in society like anyone else. And I think that that's an incredible model. And if other communities could do that, could get people to rise above the poverty line, to be able to operate with everyone else, like we can all coexist. I wish other cities would just look at a city like this and copy the model.
You may have already just stolen my question here, but one of the things we've been asking here on this program is really what the title is, Buffalo, What's Next? What should be next for the city? I mean, that's a huge question, and there's no simple answer, but is there something that flashes to your mind when it comes to, this is something that could be done, and it could be done quickly, it could help in so many ways?
That's a big question.
Yes.
What could be done? I think the first thing that needs to be done, let's start at the bottom. The first thing that needs to be done is to improve the health outcomes for people living east of Main Street in Buffalo. Having one grocery store, and I'm going to be honest because I don't live up there anymore, Tops is not the best grocery store. Okay? I can say that because there are no Tops here. There are no, advertisers.
And that's why I had you on, Madison, because I wanted someone who could say something like that. No offense to Tops.
Yeah, no offense to Tops.
Right.
But it's not the best grocery store. And people will say, like, I even went in and bought produce there compared to the Wegmans that was next to my place on the west side. The apples to apples are not the same. So I think the first thing that needs to be done is to have a new grocery store, and I see that they're remodeling and reopening the Tops there. I live next to a grocery store here in Atlanta. This is a terrible name, and there's just no way around it, but they call it Murder Kroger because there used to be several homicides at this grocery store, and nobody wanted to go. They tore the whole thing down, and they rebuilt a beautiful store. And it completely changed. Like, people can go there now, and they don't have that same association. They still call it that, but it's a different association. So I really would have loved to see them tear down that Tops, but I just know it's not possible because there are no other grocery store options. So first step, improve health outcomes by creating not just one, but several places where people can go to get fresh food and produce. Put a gym somewhere. I remember there's not a gym within 16 miles of the zip code 14215. Like, there's not a major gym. I remember one of my reports, I did some research on that. So I think that is the very first thing that we need to do in order to help grow, because that improves life expectancy, that improves ability to work, to have employment. So start with health, and then have me back on the show, and we can talk about step 2, 3, and 4.
In Madison, I couldn't help but notice as you were giving that answer, though you were only here 3 years, you were using the word "we." You have a strong emotional connection to the city.
I do. I tell people, like, it's home.
Madison Carter, I really appreciate your time. Continued success in Atlanta, and hopefully the next time you come back to Buffalo will be to stay here for a little while longer.
We'll see.
That was Jay Moran with Madison Carter from June 14th of last year. Next, we continue with Jay Moran as he speaks with Harper Bishop from June 16th of last year.
And welcome back to Buffalo, What's Next? I'm Jay Moran, and joining me, Harper Bishop, a longtime advocate for housing justice here in the city of Buffalo. Harper, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
You had a chance actually to listen to Mark Talley and Tony Bruce there talk a little bit about this, and you were responding throughout. What are your takeaways from the conversation we just heard?
There's so many emotions, so many thoughts that were running through my head. But I think the takeaways for me are really that these are the first steps, that action needs to be taken. And the talk and the conversations that we're having, what this show has allowed people, everyday people, to come on and say about their city is incredibly important. But without the action behind it, then where will we be, right? And what will happen after, as we know, the cameras have cleared, and all those in our community who are looking to make progress and have for many years cited that policies have gotten to us to the place that we are at today. What policies can we look at and move forward to create a more just, equitable Buffalo?
I want to get into those policies, obviously, and that's something you can really enlighten us on, because we hear, redlining. That's tossed out. It's tossed out. It's tossed out. Redlining had a lot to do with the way the city is right now. Before we get into that, though, just a little bit, you're somebody I can only picture has spent time on almost every city street. There aren't a lot of people that we can say that about in the city of Buffalo. You know the strengths. You see these neighborhoods. How hopeful are you that there can be the type of improvement that I think we all want to see, and that has been highlighted here by the conditions that we're seeing on Jefferson Avenue right now, with as many people call it food apartheid? What do you see inside those neighborhoods that say, yeah, this is where we can be if we make some changes?
So I feel today, at least, incredibly hopeful. If you talk to me on 5/14 or the immediate math thereafter, I would say that it was hard for me to find the hope. I felt the despair. I felt the grief. I felt the anger of so many in our community that were responding to those moments. Today we have folks like Mark Talley, who just spoke so powerfully about the actions that he and others are taking, whether it's here in Buffalo or traveling to Washington, D.C. to testify and to talk to our lawmakers, policymakers, decision makers at the highest level about what needs to change here. And people have been very pointed in what they're seeing. As you've mentioned, food apartheid, the reason that people use this phrase and don't say food desert is because food deserts are natural occurrences. Food apartheid really highlights that these are policy decisions that have been made. I think that people are pointing out neoliberalism and the idea that the quote free market is not colorblind. It actually takes into account particularly Black folks who have been left out of the economy, have been left out. That's why we have one Tops to service many people on the east side of Buffalo. And so what people are talking about in their solutions are that we have people who are first responders. We've seen people lining Jefferson. We've seen community groups and organizations and community-based organizations that have been flourishing and functioning for decades now get the attention they rightfully deserve. Black-led organizations, and we can name many that are right there on Jefferson, who have taken the lead. Whereas food apartheid and that conversation were not taking place even a month and a half ago in a real way. It's been moved up the agenda so quickly. The African Heritage Food Co-op, the work that they're doing, the Fruit Belt community has said that they want that in their community for years. And now, rightfully, are fundraising at the scale that it always should have been able to be fundraising at, and be a place that people can come and have a self-sufficient, self-determined sort of community that like it was decades ago.
I was really interested in the way you described how capitalism, neoliberalism, there we go. Mm-hmm. Is not colorblind. We found that out, right?
Right.
You are somebody who's spent over a decade now dealing with, housing justice issues here in the city of Buffalo. How stark, how over the top and obvious are some of those situations? I mean, and if you can, offer examples of just how you have seen racism make an impact on housing situations in the city of Buffalo.
Sure, they're omnipresent. You can't talk about housing without talking about housing discrimination. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, whose father is Dr. Henry Taylor, has written prolifically about race for profit and what that means. When we talk to people, you've had Denise Barr, a community leader, on here already. She speaks very eloquently about redlining is not a thing of the past. People try to say that that's a practice that is long gone. It's yesteryear. It is not yesteryear. It is omnipresent in housing, in Black folks particularly being able to buy and build generational wealth. That was the impetus for and the idea of founding the Fruit Belt Community Land Trust, so that folks would be able to determine what it is that they wanted to see in terms of housing, and to make decisions based on and have affordable housing in perpetuity. If Shirley Chisholm says, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own chair.
Right.
Instead, the Fruit Belt Community Land Trust said, we're going to build our own table. We can virtually build an insulated and insular, community in which we have a community land trust in which we own both the land underneath and the housing above to retain it for generational wealth building. If you look on the west side and what is happening, lead in homes and this is all over, but particularly where I've worked on the west side, astronomical. I had a former foster daughter whose lead, was in a very unhealthy,
And she had impacts of lead poisoning.
Yeah, well, she did, and. If 5 or below is a safe zone, her numbers were over 20 when she came to us, and has been dealing with that ever since. Erie County does track people, and they've been tracking individuals. Once you get into the system, they do a good job of tracking that. But it's that you have to be tested and all of those things, and you have to have, steady, ability to be tested. And then you have to have landlords that are taking responsibility for, cleaning up lead for the housing stock as it is. And that oftentimes doesn't happen. We have a lot of absentee landlords. They do not live in Buffalo. They are not taking responsibility for that. So when we talk about housing stock, when we talk about even ownership and who owns housing, that is leaving out Black, Latinx, other communities of color to a great degree, to a great extent. And of course, we know the GI Bill, how it evolved, and how white ownership was obviously able to assist white ownership at a disproportionate amount. A lot of people that moved out to the suburbs, and of course we have the urban core being left where people of color had to start with banks not giving them.
Is that better now? Is it better now though with banks? Are banks better at that? Because redlining, and I see you grit your teeth as you're ready to answer that, but because the redlining was really about banks and their lending practices. Is it better now? Are they doing enough? And what could be done, I guess, maybe to make more capital available in these neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's banks of Evans Bank just recently, in recent history, was tagged with being a lender that was not giving to and providing mortgages to community members in Black and brown communities. So that's recent history. They were held accountable. They're doing better now, but because there was accountability.
Right.
I just tuned into the Common Council hearing this past week, and the talk was around Chase putting ATM right in front of the Meriwether Library, even though they had not made a commitment to African American and Black identifying people for many years, right? And there were people, as Council President Pridgeon said, right down the road who have branches or have been in the community for a long time. So what we see, unfortunately, in the wake of this tragedy is you see, again, banks and other lenders and people who were never invested in the Black community and in Black Buffalo and Jefferson in particularly, now taking advantage of a moment for profit. And that's what corporations do. And it leads back to my point around capitalism, neoliberalism, and how people will morph and change. And as Mark was talking about, the efficiency of white supremacy is that you will continue. We have disaster capitalism. This is an example of that. This is a terrorist capitalist example of people taking advantage, corporations morphing to fit the moment, and that's unacceptable.
We have to take a short break. We'll be right back with more Buffalo What's Next on WBFO.
How does music help and heal? Find out from our amazing guests on Mindful Music from Buffalo, Toronto Public Media. Join me, Carl Shalahorn, Saturdays at 4 p.m. on WBFO, your NPR station.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter at WBFO or email us at news@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
We're talking with Harper Bishop this morning on Buffalo What's Next. Harper, for a long time with Push Buffalo, now segueing away from the organization at this time, but still obviously very much committed to housing justice here in the city of Buffalo. What is the capital availability? If you're somebody who grows up on Jefferson or off of Jefferson, perhaps in East Utica or wherever the case may be, what are the possibilities for somebody? Compare their possibilities of getting capital to either buy a house or improve a home compared to somebody who lives in a white suburb.
Yeah, well, we know that those chances and those differences are very stark. That there are numbers, and I won't quote them, but I think it's 4 to 5 times what a white person will be able to access as compared to a Black household. And in the suburbs, I mean, I always tell people if they want to see an example of leakage, all they have to do at 5 p.m. is go to the 33 and they will watch car after car exit the city of Buffalo and retreat back to white suburbs, or predominantly white suburbs. And so all of those jobs that otherwise could be held by city residents, and primarily, as we know, Buffalo has been a predominantly Black, POC-led city, right. and those statistics are there since early 2000s, and so all the jobs that would be given to folks of color are not being given to folks of color. They're actually highly educated people who are coming into, and it's been made very clear the Kensington Expressway. I mean, I think I heard it called recently the biggest homage to white supremacy in the city of Buffalo, because it cuts through the black neighborhood on purpose, intentionally taking power from them and, driving that through as a way for people from the suburbs to get in for jobs and job creation. So I think that people feel that there are not opportunities, there are not living wage jobs, there are not the things that need to be put in place. Of course, we have the Northland Workforce Center. I know, Push obviously is working on a sustainable workforce development center on the west side as well. But those need to be more prolific. There need to be more jobs available. They need to be good, family-sustaining wages. And we can't continue to give our public dollars to projects like Tesla that promise hundreds and thousands of jobs, don't deliver, and then there's no clawbacks to get our public dollars back. And so people have been complaining about this for a very long time, but that's a right complaint. It's actually a systemic issue that needs to be addressed, and who is getting those jobs, where are they being placed, et cetera. And we know that the architecture of the city has been to really allow and prioritize white folks that are highly educated to first and foremost get those jobs. When I used to work in the Fruit Belt, I would canvass regularly all of those streets. And of course, that's just a few blocks away from the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus. And I never met one person who said they had a job on the medical campus.
Even though you're within easy walking distance of
campus.
Yeah,
right. Easy, yeah. And so the economic development and just the idea of who gets the jobs, who is prioritized, never one person said to me, I'm working as a nurse there, or and again, that could be that I missed some people, and there, right. I didn't talk to every single person, but if you think generally canvassing a neighborhood over and over, I would come about speaking to someone who had some position on the medical corridor.
I had a chance to meet you at the press event a couple of weeks ago over on Carlton Street, where Alex Wright was there talking about the African Heritage Food Co-op. Can you picture that neighborhood with that co-op functioning at the level that Alex is talking about, and what that would mean for that neighborhood, and how it might be a model for other neighborhoods in the city?
So that is exactly how we envisioned it when we were creating the Community Land Trust, was to think that what we call it is a local living economy. And so what has happened at a meta level is that there's been extraction of resources, natural resources, and exploitation of workers. And the idea is to create a regenerative economy in which you have well-being and people and functionality really being centered. In this instance, the idea was to own the land and to petition the city that there's 200 lots in that particular neighborhood alone. That means that we won 50 of them, so a quarter of the lots. The idea was to use the land as a building block to then create the community that previously existed. People talk all the time about the fruit trees and the grocery stores, and that it was a self-contained neighborhood, just like the one I grew up in East Aurora, that I could walk to anything that I needed and have what I needed right there. The Fruit Belt, there's no reason why that cannot happen. There's social life happening, there's churches, there's community centers. The Moot Center hosts senior activities, and then the idea is that you would build gardens that could be self-sufficient. During COVID-19, we saw how the supply chain breakdown really was difficult, and why we need resiliency in our food systems. And then a grocery store which would provide for the neighborhood the food that it needs right there, Black ownership, cooperative ownership, and then paying living wage jobs to people in the neighborhood so that they are employed. As you talked about, we haven't had jobs for people in the community, and this is also a job generator, right? And so it's the best and version of what the Fruit Belt hopes would be. And for us, as you've said, much like we don't think that the Green Development Zone on the west side is like decision making for everybody. It's one example of what can be modeled, and that's kind of the old growth. And the Fruit Belt is a new growth of showing an example of a East Buffalo community that can do exactly the same thing. So the grocery store is not made to feed all of East Buffalo. It's to say, Fruit Belt and Cold Spring and Hamlin Park, every neighborhood should have this. So should disgustingly a terrorist attack happen, there are still grocers online where people can go and walk to and be in community.
Harper, we heard Mark Talley. You and I were sitting here in this studio listening to Mark and Tony Bruce and Dave Debo talking in the other studio. And this is we're down to about 2 minutes here. So I thought about this. You heard Mark talk, I thought, with a remarkable amount of optimism is what I got from him. This is a man who just lost his mother in this May 14th shooting. Talking about the community groups he's seeing on Jefferson Avenue. You've been in this now for over a decade when it comes to housing justice. And you've seen a few political ebbs and flows. You know, the election's here, things get highlighted, things go to the wayside. Any different sense of hope, of optimism for you, knowing the problems that still exist?
Yeah, you know, I was incredibly impressed by Mark and the fortitude and just determination and the power of hope that he brought really heartened me. And as you've said, if he can do that in the face of all of this and losing his mother, it absolutely today gave me a different perspective and a more hopeful one. I am heartened and hopeful because I see on a daily basis I get to work with the doers in our city, the people who are committed to, when times get tough, to really hunkering down and doing the good work and saying that we need more of it. We need more people. And I think there's more people that are coming into the movement because of this moment. And we welcome all of them with open arms. And so what I do see is I see a political strategy developing of individuals who want to run for office. They're saying that the status quo is no longer okay. If our elected officials can't get it done now, they're never going to get it done, and there needs to be a new political era, is what I'm hearing in the neighborhoods. I'm also seeing people power, that people are being relentless in going to their elected officials and making them understand that you serve us, not vice versa. And I see people responding both short-term and long-term, and that long-term strategy is going to see our city through.
That was Jay Moran with Harper Bishop from June 16th of last year. And we end the show with excerpts from Making Spaces panel discussion at Buffalo Art Studio from December 15th of last year.
We start with architectural designer Justina Jama. Her unique project at Buffalo Art Studio made castings of many of the historic and, in many cases, crumbling structures of Buffalo's East Side. That work also provided insight into the real living conditions of some of the city's poorest neighborhoods.
I was here in the 2021 cycle for the Activism in the Arts program that fall, and the work I did was about exploring the post-industrial landscape of Buffalo, specifically for this past exhibit, the East Side community, and a big part of the project was about engagement with the community. So I went through legal channels to kind of cast these misused or otherwise seemingly abandoned buildings, and met a lot of neat people along the way who kind of have similar outlooks on what they want to see in the future on the Buffalo's East Side, and starting some interesting conversations on what we can do in that community.
Architectural designer Justina Jama. For these panel discussions, Buffalo Art Studio looks to bring together a wide array of perspectives. Certainly the arts are represented, and so is scholarship. And for that aspect, they welcomed Dr. Henry Louis Taylor Jr.
I'm both a historian and an urban planner, so in many respects, I think of myself as a time traveler. I'm as comfortable in 1820 as I am in 50-50, and we haven't even gotten there yet. I say 50-50 because planning is always about the future. And my work itself centers around the processes of change over time, with a particular emphasis on how we build cities. And my working ongoing hypothesis is that in the United States, the way we build cities is racist and is based on class exclusion and the dehumanization of people We have no respect for human dignity in this country, and that's reflected in the way in which we build cities. And I say we have no respect for human life or dignity because if we did, the only way we would be able to see the conditions on the East Side is to go to some kind of history museum where those kinds of historical artifacts would be located. The past year on Buffalo's East Side, I think, has been characterized by three kinds of trends. On the one level, I've seen a continuing awakening of the residents in those communities. And people have started grassroots movements to rebuild and transform their communities and their neighborhoods. And there's been a higher level of organization down on the ground and inside of the neighborhoods and the communities that's there. And we see it at all locations and all places. I'm also the chairman of the board of the King Urban Life Center, which is located on Genesee Street in the Broadway-Fillmore area. And even in that place, which has really been devastated by Buffalo city building process, we see that. Started working with groups in a number of different locations and places, and I'm sure Denise will talk about the things that are going on in the Fruit Belt. That's at one level. At another level, we have seen a growing interest in people wanting to invest on the East Side. And right now, based on our count, over $2 billion are either being planned and implemented in projects that are being developed. And that doesn't even include the governor's $1 billion for the coverage of a certain part of the East Side. So we see dollars flowing into the East Side. Then we see some really bad things, mostly coming from City Hall, mostly coming from greedy entrepreneurs. And these things are taking two forms. One is the emergence of all these symbolic projects. And I say a project is symbolic because it's designed to create hope and possibility in a moment when they know nothing is going to happen. It's a game. And so we say these symbolic projects because they will never lead to the structural transformation of these communities. They're full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The other dimension is that white folks, in their ingenuity, have found a way to turn the East Side into a big jobs program for white folks. Understand it. When we talk about $2, maybe $3 billion being invested on the East Side, we must ask the question, who gets the contracts? Who gets the jobs? And they will mostly be white folks. And those dollars will flow through the black community like water through a sieve, en route to the suburban communities where they will, in fact, multiply and produce greater jobs and greater opportunities. So with all of this money coming in, we see folks out in the suburbs popping champagne corks and lighting cigars because this is the beginning of a good time for them. And City Hall is the architect of all of that. I better stop now.
Dr. Henry Louis Taylor Jr. Now, one of the city's grassroots activists, Denise Barr.
Interesting conversation. I was talking with a young woman today who I like a lot, and she was talking about a project that they're looking to do, you know, in the neighborhood, and she was very excited. And I tried to relate to her the fact that my neighborhood has had so many broken promises and broken dreams. You know, it feels a lot like when I come out of my house, or when you come out of your house and you see how the leaves have fallen, and they're just scattered all over the place. And they're really pretty, right? But they don't really serve any purpose once they fall off the tree. And they just move and they scatter as they want to. And you can't really do anything with them and pick them up and put them to another location where they blow around somewhere else. That's what it feels like a lot for us. There's all of these things that have been promised, all of these dreams and hopes over generations that have just fallen down onto the ground and scattered around our feet. And we have to just try to shuffle them around and move around them and keep on going. I always say to people, you know, I know for people that don't live in Black communities, they see things in the news about crime. The reality of the situation is that we are always being used for someone's figment of imagination to create a situation where they benefit off of us. It's generational, it's not new, but it still is painful.
UB professor Matt Kenyon.
And I'm in my 5th year in Buffalo. I moved here with my wife, Laura Maris, about 5 years ago. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the central sculpture in the exhibition that I put together with Jason Ferguson, one of my colleagues from Eastern Michigan, the central sculpture is called Kicking the Ladder, and it's a brand new piece that is a variation on a project called Tide. And so inside the Champagne Tower are tiny little sculptures of modeled after actual houses from the west side of Buffalo where I live, and also in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where my family lives. And in 2016, my family and a large part of the Baton Rouge community were flooded by a storm. It wasn't a hurricane, it was one of these new types of storms that just sort of parks itself over a part of the city that previously hadn't really flooded, and proceeded to flood the hundreds, thousands of homes. The negative impacts of that continue to this day. And so in response to that event, and thinking about the impending housing crisis that is really intersectional with the climate crisis that we're all experiencing, wanted to create a sculpture that talked about the sort of mythologies about trickle-down economics, right? This idea, this false idea that, you know, if you give the wealthy enough money, that some of it will trickle down. And I prefer, there's another story to it, another metaphor. It's the story of the horse and the sparrow. And that is, if you feed a horse enough oats, some of it will pass down to the sparrows on the street. And I think, you know, that's a little more accurate story of our economic situation. But anyway, so the houses are cast out of a material that has the same refractive index as water, and so they effectively disappear. And what I think, you know, I've seen and we continue to see is that after these climate events, that the media moves on to the next tragedy, and the people who have been negatively impacted are left. You know, the real trickle down is the negative externalities of these, the housing crisis and the climate crisis.
We have to liberate our minds and rethink how we build cities in order to deal with the kinds of issues that we're talking about, of abandonment, of the way in which they build cities. I mean, like right now, with the billions of dollars that was talking about earlier that are being invested on the east side, those projects are meaningless because none of them are connected to neighborhoods and communities. They're just site-based projects with limited visions. The way you're supposed to do that kind of work is you have a neighborhood. And then on the basis of that neighborhood and deep interactions with all of the people who live in the neighborhood, you generate an idea of the place you want to create. And when you go about planning and development in that way, and then if you anchor it around a notion of common resources, we call it the commons, people need to gain control over those resources. The hard reality is that on Buffalo's East Side, black people and others that live there, we don't own and control the land on which neighborhoods and communities are being built. Somebody else owns and controls that land. The other fact is that the community is the site of intense predatory investments. It's a lie that the East Side is a site of disinvestment. That's just a lie. I'll give you two concrete examples. The state, in scattering all of its lottery machinery around, sucks some $32 million a year out of East Side. Now, folks will say, well, why are the people paying the lottery in the first place? If you ask somebody on the East Side, they'll smile and laugh. And you say, you only got a 1 in a million chance of winning. And they'll say, and if I don't play, I got no chance to get the resources to make my life better. So 1 in a million is better than none. So the point that I'm making is, we can't do these things the way we're currently building cities. Right now, all over the East Side, including the Fruit Belt, the mayor has turned vacant land into a commodity. In the Fruit Belt, Reverend Chapman bought 3 lots for a project he was going to develop. I'll let Denise evaluate the project. But the city charged him $90,000 for 3 unkept vacant lots that are appraised at only about $16,000, and that's an inflated price. Then all over the city, so what I'm saying is, those are common goods, resources. The Fruit Belt ought to own and control them. And this way we get the resources that we would need to develop the community in a just way.
All I know is that we have to try to preserve what we have, what we can hang on to. We have to fight together. When I say we, I'm talking about the alliances that I work with. I'm talking about the people that really strive together to bring a conversation that says there's been enough damage done, even to the point of talking about the expressway. You know, it took me a long time to understand that this was something that happened across the nation. This wasn't just something that happened to my community. It felt personal because it happened to us. But this happened to communities of color all across the nation, that communities were divided for white flight. At some point, you know what? I keep telling people, they're coming for us. At some point, they're coming for you too. Don't be comfortable, because wherever you live, if they haven't looked at it yet and seen how they can make a profit of it, they're coming. They're going to find a way to get to you just like they got to where we are. So, you know, I'm about trying to build relationships and let people know, you know, we have to be able to protect what we have left.
And that will do it for today's Summertime Producer Pick episode. We would like to thank our guests, Madison Carter, Harper Bishop, and a panel at Buffalo Arts Studio. If you missed this and you'd like to hear it again, a reminder that this program is a podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts or the new Amplified BTPM app. And each episode is available online on demand at WBFO.org. This is WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOL in Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown, your NPR station. This is Charles Gilbert. Thanks for listening.